There is a rhythm to history. It is a heartbeat that most of us never hear, because it beats too slowly for a single human life to register. But if you zoom out, if you look at the timeline of human civilization, not in years, but in centuries, the rhythm becomes a drumbeat. It is loud, it is repetitive, and it is terrifying. We are raised to believe that the world we live in is static. We look at our maps, our borders, our currencies, and our capitals, and we assume they are permanent fixtures. We assume that Washington, D.C., London, or Beijing are eternal, but history tells a different story. History tells us that the global superpower is the most temporary position on Earth. Over the last 500 years, 3 distinct global superpowers have risen to absolute dominance. They controlled the oceans, they controlled the gold. Their language was the language of trade. Their military was invincible. And in every single case, they collapsed. Not from an alien invasion, not from a meteor strike, but from within. They collapsed because of a specific mathematical sequence of events. A pattern, a script that history follows with frightening precision. In 1590, Spain was the master of the universe. 80 years later, it was a broken third-rate power. In 1914, Great Britain commanded an empire where the sun never set. 30 years later, it was bankrupt and dissolving. In 1945, the Soviet Union was a colossus of steel and nuclear fire. 45 years later, it vanished from the map in a single winter. 3 empires, 3 collapses, 1 pattern. And right now, in the United States, we aren't just looking at the pattern, we are living it. We are not at the beginning of the cycle. We are not approaching the danger zone. We are deep inside the machinery of decline. The scary part isn't that empires die. The scary part is that the people living inside them never see it coming until the very last moment. They think they are different. They think their technology, or their culture, or their exceptionalism will save them. This is the story of that pattern. This is the anatomy of how a superpower commits suicide. It happens in 7 distinct stages. And if you look at the date, not the politics, but the raw numbers, the United States has already completed 5 of them. The blueprint, the Spanish tragedy, 1500-1650. To understand where we are going, we have to go back to the original blueprint. We have to go back to the first true global superpower, the Spanish Empire. Picture the world in the mid-1500s. After Columbus, Spain didn't just discover a new continent. They discovered the largest lottery ticket in human history. They conquered the Aztec and Inca empires. They didn't just find land, they found mountains of money. They found Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, literal mountain of silver. By 1550, Spanish galleons were crossing the Atlantic in convoys, sitting low in the water, heavy with hundreds of tons of silver and gold. Spain possessed more wealth than any nation had ever possessed. King Philip II controlled the money supply of Europe. The Spanish real was the first global reserve currency. If you were a merchant in China, a trader in India, or a banker in Italy, you wanted Spanish silver. It was the dollar of its day. But this wealth created a fatal psychological disease. It's a disease called hubris. When you have unlimited money, you stop worrying about how much things cost. And that brings us to stage 1, military overextension. King Philip believed he was chosen by God to police the world. Sound familiar? He didn't just defend Spain. He defended Catholicism across the entire globe. He fought the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. He fought the French in Italy. He fought Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. He planned invasions of England. By 1580, Spain had troops fighting on 4 continents. They were the world's policemen, and the cost was astronomical. It didn't matter how much silver came out of the mines in America. The war machine ate it faster than they could dig it up. So, what do you do when you are the richest empire on earth, but you can't pay your bills? You cheat. This is stage 2, currency debasement. The Spanish crown couldn't raise taxes high enough to pay for their global wars. So, they started looking at their silver coins. They thought, what if we mix a little copper in here? Nobody will notice. A coin that was 100% silver became 95%, then 80%, then 50%. Eventually, the Spanish currency was almost entirely copper, dipped in a silver wash to make it look real. The government kept spending it at face value. They called it stimulus. But the market isn't stupid. Merchants realized the coins were junk, so they raised prices. If the coin is worth half as much, bread costs twice as much. Inflation exploded across the empire. This led directly to stage 3, the debt spiral. Spain began borrowing. They borrowed from German bankers, Italian merchant families, anyone who would lend to them. They used the future shipments of American silver as collateral. They were spending money they hadn't even mined yet. It worked for a while, until the interest payments became larger than the revenue. In 1557, at the absolute height of Spanish power, Spain declared bankruptcy. They defaulted, but they didn't stop. They restructured the debt and did it again. They defaulted in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596, for bankruptcies in 40 years. During the Golden Age, but the real killer wasn't the debt. It was what the easy money did to the Spanish soul. This is stage 4, loss of productive capacity. Because Spain had all this gold and silver, they didn't think they needed to make anything. Why build a factory when you can just buy cloth from the Dutch? Why grow food when you can buy grain from the French? The Spanish elite looked down on manual labor. Industry withered. Innovation died. Spain became a hollow shell conduit. The gold came in from America and went straight out to pay the British, the Dutch, and the French for manufactured goods. Spain became rich in cash, but poor in production. By 1600, when the silver mines started to run dry, there was no economy left to fall back on. The greatest power on earth collapsed into a second-rate nation of beggars, bureaucrats, and fading aristocrats. They never recovered their position. The Financier, the fall of Britain, 1900 to 1950. Fast forward 300 years, the players change, but the script remains exactly the same. By 1900, Great Britain is the new Rome. The British pound sterling is the new Spanish real, the unshakable standard of global wealth. London is the financial capital of the world. Britain controlled 25% of the Earth's land surface. 1 in 4 people on the planet was a subject of the Queen. They controlled the trade routes, the insurance markets, and the banking systems. They were the architects of the modern world, but, like Spain, they confused dominance with permanence. Stage 1. Military overextension. Britain was overstretched. They had garrisons in India, Singapore, Kenya, Egypt, Canada, the Caribbean. They had to maintain a navy larger than the next 2 navies combined. The cost of being the world's guarantor of peace was eating them alive. Then came 1914, World War I. Britain had a choice: step back and preserve the empire, or jump into a continental war. To maintain their status, they chose war. In 4 years, Britain spent a century's worth of accumulated wealth. They went from being the world's creditor, the nation everyone owed money, to the world's biggest debtor. Who did they borrow from? The rising power across the ocean, the United States. Stage 2. Currency debasement. To pay for the war, Britain had to abandon the gold standard. They printed paper pounds to buy bullets. Inflation ravaged the economy. After the war, in a desperate attempt to look strong, they tried to peg the pound to gold again at the old price. It was a disaster. It decimated their exports. Then came World War II. If World War I cracked the foundation, World War II bulldozed the house. By 1945, Britain was victorious, but they were destitute. They owed billions to America. Their cities were bombed out. Their industry was exhausted. This triggered stage 4, loss of empire. You cannot hold an empire with IOUs. In 1947, Britain lost Indiotha, jewel in the crown. It wasn't a military defeat. Britain simply couldn't afford to be there anymore. Then the dominoes fell. Palestine, Malaya, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya. In the span of 20 years, the empire evaporated. And finally, stage 5 and 6, currency collapse and loss of reserve status. Throughout the 1900s, the world slowly realized the pound sterling wasn't as good as gold anymore. The dollar was taking over. The final humiliation came in different waves, but the trend was clear. In 1941, British pound could buy for US dollars. By the 1980s, it was nearing parity. The pound became just another currency, used by tourists and locals, but ignored by the rest of the world. Britain went from ruling the waves to being an island nation struggling to keep the lights on, largely dependent on the United States for security. A junior partner in the world they used to own. The hollow giant, the Soviet collapse, 1945 to 1991. Now, let's look at the most recent example, the Soviet Union. This one is important because of the speed. Spain took a century to rot. Britain took 50 years to decline. The Soviet Union went from a superpower to non-existence in less than a decade. Post-1945, the USSR was a beast. They had the tanks, they had the nuclear warheads, and they had the ideological confidence. They believed history was on their side. But they skipped straight to the trap. Stage 1. Military overextension. The Soviet Union had an economy half the size of the United States, but they tried to maintain a military that was equal in size. They were spending 15% to 20% of their GDP on defense. America was spending 5% to 7%. They were subsidizing revolutions everywhere: Vietnam, Cuba, Angola, Afghanistan. They were bleeding money to look powerful. Stage 2. Economic stagnation, the productive loss. The Soviet economy was a mirage. It produced steel and oil, but it couldn't produce jeans, cars, or decent food. Central planning strangled innovation. While the West was inventing the microchip, the Soviets were still trying to meet quotas for tractor parts that didn't work. They became entirely dependent on oil exports. When the price of oil was high, they could hide the rot. They could buy grain from the West to feed their people. But in the 1980s, the price of oil crashed. Stage 3. The debt and currency crisis. The Soviets started borrowing heavily from Western banks to keep the system running. They printed rubles that nobody wanted. Inside the USSR, the ruble was money. Outside the USSR, it was paper. Then came the final stage: social decay and political collapse. The people stopped believing. The cynicism in the Soviet Union in the 1980s was absolute. Nobody believed the government. Nobody believed the news. Corruption was the only way to get anything done. Alcoholism skyrocketed. Life expectancy actually dropped a rare feat for an industrialized nation. When the end came, it wasn't a war. There was no invasion of Moscow. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviets couldn't afford to intervene. In 1991, the entire structure just quit. It dissolved. A superpower with 30,000 nuclear weapons simply turned off the lights and went home. The economy imploded. The currency became worthless overnight. Life savings were wiped out. 3 empires, 3 different centuries. But the pattern is identical. Extend the military beyond what you can afford. Debase the currency to pay for it. Hollow out your real economy. Lose the trust of the world. Collapse. Which brings us to today. Which brings us to the United States of America. The American diagnosis, where we are now. If you are an American, or if you hold US dollars, this is the part where you should start getting very uncomfortable. Because we aren't just following the pattern, we are accelerating it. Let's go through the checklist. Stage 1. Military overextension. The United States maintains approximately 750 military bases in 80 countries. We have active engagements or special forces operations in countless more. We are funding a war in Eastern Europe. We are arming the Middle East. We are preparing for conflict in the Pacific. Our military budget is nearly $900 billion a year, more than the next 10 nations combined. And yet, our stockpiles are depleting. We are stretched thin. We are the global policeman, just like Philip II was. And just like Philip II, we are paying for it with money we don't have. Stage 2. Currency debasement. In 1971, we did exactly what Britain and Spain did. We severed the link between our currency and tangible value. We went off the gold standard. Since then, the dollar has been a promise, and for a long time, that promise was good. But look at the last 4 years. Since 2020, the United States has printed trillions of dollars. We increased the M2 money supply by 40% in 2 years. We created more dollars in a few years than we did in the first 2 centuries of our existence. The result? The inflation you see at the grocery store. That isn't corporate greed or supply chains. That is your currency losing value because there is too much of it. That is the Spanish copper coin phenomenon happening in real time. Stage 3. The debt spiral. This is the most terrifying number. The U.S. national debt is over $36 trillion, but the debt amount isn't the problem. The interest is the problem. As interest rates rose, the cost to service that debt exploded. The U.S. government now spends more on interest payments to bondholders than it spends on the entire defense budget. We are borrowing money just to pay the interest on the money we borrowed before. That is the definition of a death spiral. There is no mathematical way to pay this back. We will either default like Spain or we will print the money to pay it, destroying the currency like post-WWI Germany. There is no third door. Stage 4. Loss of productive capacity. Walk through a Walmart. Pick up 10 items. Look at the made in label. We did exactly what Spain did. We financialized our economy. We became great at banking, great at apps, great at services. But we shipped the factories, the steel mills, and the chemistry plants overseas. If a war broke out tomorrow that cut off global shipping, the United States could not produce its own antibiotics. We could not produce the high-tech components for our own missiles. We have become a consumer economy dependent on our rivals to sell us the rope we are hanging ourselves with. Stage 5. Social decay. This is the phase we are living in right now. The polarization, the anger, the total loss of trust in institutions. Congress, the media, the Supreme Court, the banks. Approval ratings are at historic lows. When the economy turns extractive, when the rich get richer, not by building things, but by manipulating money, while the working class gets crushed by inflation, society fractures. We see crime rising. We see drug epidemics killing 100,000 people a year. We see a political system that is paralyzed, unable to pass a budget, unable to agree on reality. This is exactly what the Soviet Union looked like in 1985. This is what Spain looked like in 1600. The future, stages 6 and 7. So, what is left? What are the final 2 stages? Stage 6, loss of reserve currency status. This is the cliff edge. Right now, the only thing keeping the US afloat is that the world has to use dollars to buy oil and conduct trade. This allows us to print money and export our inflation to the rest of the world. But the world is watching. They see the weaponization of the dollar. They see the debt, and they are moving. China and Russia are trading in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia is considering accepting other currencies for oil. Central banks around the world are buying gold at a record pace, dumping dollars to buy the only asset that governments print. When the world stops accepting the dollar, when those trillions of dollars overseas come flooding back home, hyperinflation, woe, won't be a theory. It will be a reality. And that leads to stage 7, imperial collapse. It doesn't mean the United States disappears. Spain is still there. Britain is still there. But the empire ends, the standard of living collapses. The influence vanishes. The ability to dictate terms to the world evaporates. It happens fast. As Hemingway said about bankruptcy, 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly. We are in the gradually phase. We are seeing the cracks. The bridges are rusting. The debt is mounting. The allies are hedging their bets. The tragedy of history is that we know the pattern. It is written in the ruins of Rome, in the empty palaces of Madrid, in the reduced circumstances of London. We know that to stop it, we would need to do the impossible. Massively cut spending, endure a deep recession to clear the bad debt, rebuild our industry from scratch, and unite a divided people. But political systems rarely choose pain today for gain tomorrow. They choose the easy way. They print more money. They start more wars to distract the populace. They kick the can down the road until the road ends. The United States has completed 5 of the 7 stages. We are teetering on the edge of the 6th. The pattern has destroyed 3 global superpowers in the last 500 years. The question isn't whether the pattern is real. The question is, do you think we are the one exception in human history? Or are we just the next chapter in the same old book? Look at your money. Look at your government. Look at the world, and you tell me.